My name is Abraham Landa. I'm a PhD candidate in Ethnomusicology at the University of Oregon here. Today I'll be sharing insights from my summer 2024 fieldwork in Costa Chica, Mexico, which was generally supported by the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. So that's the first thing I want to do I want to start by sincerely thanking the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. Your support made this research trip possible, and I want to emphasize that fieldwork was essential for me because it allowed me to move from early stage exploratory questions into developing a full dissertation proposal, which was successfully accepted this past fall. Thank you. So I'd like to talk about the project overview to begin with and give you a little bit of background. In 2019, an amendment to Article 2 of the Mexican Constitution formally recognized people of African descent as part of the nation's cultural composition. The 2020 census reflected the shift, with nearly 2% of the population self-identifying as Afrodescendiente or Afro-Mexican. These milestones followed decades of activism in Costa Chica, where organizations such as Mexico Negro, Asociación Civil have worked to increase visibility and secure rights through performances that emphasize distinct cultural performances. So my project examines these Afro-Mexican cultural expressions, especially in the aftermath of the 2019 constitutional recognition of Afro-descendants in Mexico. I'm particularly interested in how music and dance functions as sites where identity, memory, and political recognition are actively negotiated. This is the site of investigation, Costa Chica in the southwest Pacific region of Mexico. And as you can see, it encompasses parts of Guerrero and parts of Oaxaca. In particular, the cities that I focused on were Coajimalpa, which is where Mexico Negro AC is headquartered and where the Museo de las Culturas Afro-Mestizas is located. Pinotepa Nacional, which is arguably the most important city for the genre I'm going to talk about today, called Chilena. And Puerto Escondido, a city that's been impacted heavily by tourism in recent years. And there's a lot of tension surrounding what that means for the local people there. So what were my initial research questions? First, how is Afrodescendencia constructed and expressed through performance in Costa Chica? Second, how do everyday performances interact with broader political and social processes of recognition? So first, I want to sort of address what is Afrodescendencia, because it's a very specific terminology that came following the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban. And there, the term Afrodescendiente started to gain traction through transnational activist networks. So there's international dialogue of what race means in this context. Since then, cultural performance has become a strategic leverage for recognition. And as I've already started to explain, through performances that emphasize distinct Afro-Mexican expressions, communities have asserted their place within Mexico's multicultural framework for resisting historical erasure. So for the research trip, I had three broad goals. First of all, were to map some of these performance traditions tied to this idea of Afrodescendencia, to also build community contacts in order to lay the groundwork for future research, and to access regional archives and oral histories through interviews with culture bearers there. And I'll give you an overview of some of the different activities that I did while I was there. The very first of which was the Patron Saint Festival at Pinotepa Nacional, which is where I took this photo of a group dancing the Chilena, which is a music and dance genre that took hold in the Costa Chica, specifically with Afro-Mexican communities starting in the early half of the 19th century. And the Chilena genre actually has become emblematic of Costa Chica as a whole, but there's actually a lot of tensions about the cultural ownership of this genre. And so that's one of the avenues that I'm exploring in my dissertation currently. But other things I did were interviews with cultural center organizers, Casas de Cultura. I visited the municipal libraries in Pinotepa and in Puerto Escondido, which actually have a lot of locally published texts from local historians there. And I think that's a really important perspective to consider when we're trying to tell the history of these communities. There's also cultural events like the Guelaguetza Festival, which is sort of a regional small festival modeled after the Guelaguetza, which happens in Oaxaca City. I talked to the personnel from the Museo de las Culturas Afro-Mestizas. I learned about Los Banqueros, who I'll highlight today, and I even took part in some Chilena lessons. Also, I'm going to talk about a drag performer who uses Chilena music in their performances. So these are the 4 highlights that I want to show you today, and I'll explain why they're important. So, Danza de los Diablos is sort of recognizably the most African-coded tradition in Costa Chica, and it's been used the most for its political expediency to highlight difference within this multiculturalist structure that exists right now. What's interesting, though, what I learned when I was there is these new forms of Danza de los Diablos, where they're not doing the original or the traditional music of using a donkey jawbone, a friction drum, and a harmonica, but instead what they're doing is they're doing sort of syncretic performances that incorporate Chilena music. And so this is contemporary Chilena music that's performed in conjunction with this dance, which is a take on Danza de los Diablos. So if you've seen Danza de los Diablos before, this is quite different. I showed this to somebody who's from Costa Chica, who's familiar with Danza de los Diablos, and he said, this doesn't look anything like what they were used to. So it was interesting to me, though, because it's showing that there are certain issues that kind of need teasing out. Yeah. So this is one of the issues that I want to address further in my research, is the role of Chilena as it intersects with these other types of expressions, and what does that mean? What does this syncretism actually mean? Another important meeting I had was with this group called Los Banqueros, which is a group of older gentlemen who meet at the city center in Pinotepa Nacional, and they share songs, poetry, and stories. And what's funny about their name, actually, they're called Los Banqueros because they sit on the banca in town, and that's they explained it to me. It's like, well, people think maybe they're banqueros because they are, bankers or something like that. But no, the actual truth is because they sit there on the bench. So here is an example of them singing a song by composer Álvaro Carrillo. The song is called El Andariego, which is a Chilena. And Álvaro Carrillo is actually a composer that I'm focusing on for one chapter of my dissertation. He was Afro-descendant, and he was really famous for his boleros. You probably recognize the song Sabor a mí or Se te olvida la mentira. People don't recognize that he was Afro-descendant and that he wrote Chilenas from the region of his home. And this is one of those that's being performed still here in this context. Okay, and so I talked a little bit about the Tata Santiago Patron Saint Festival of Santiago in Pinotepa. And so I'll show you a little bit of what this looks like in this setting. This is sort of, as a point of reference, what people typically think of when they think of Chilena. So what you just heard actually was a Chilena cantada, which is just a guitar and singing. This is Chilena with the full dance and everything involved with that. And this is in front of the church in Pinotepa. So that's what that looks like. On one of my last days in Costa Chica, I was able to meet a drag performer who goes by the station name Camelia. And what was most interesting to me is that Camelia uses Chilena music and other regional music in her performances, which is different to what a lot of people typically expect from drag performances in Mexico, or even specifically in Costa Chica. As Camelia explained to me, there's sort of this expectation to do this sort of strong woman archetype, like Paquita del Barrio or Gloria Trevi, this kind of sort of performance. But actually what Camelia does is bring in traditional regional musical forms in their performance. This is an example that I'm going to show you from her social media, and what I want to note is that this is a sort of another variant of Chilena, but it's from a little further inland in a town called Putla, and it's associated with a slightly different context there. Okay, so one of the most striking things that I remember Camelia telling me is when I asked Camelia, well, do you ever receive sort of like pushback about you doing this type of performance? And she said, no, actually, people have really been accepted. I don't know if this is strategic based on like where she is performing, but what followed was what she said is, this is our culture, this is what we can do. We can do whatever we want with our culture. And in this case was the idea of playing with ideas of gender, because in Chilena, it's actually a highly gendered performance. As you can see, they're dancing in pairs, And there's certain parts where, there's gender expectations that are performed through that dance. Specifically, I want to get into it more about los versos, which are points where women sort of get to tease the men, and the men tease the women too, but the woman always has the last say in that setting, which is an interesting dynamic to see actually play out. And so, through versos and through the dance and through the dress, Camelia uses Chilena. Okay, moving on. I want to talk about my interview with the people from el Museo de las Culturas Afro-Mestizas, which relates to issues of heritage politics. When I was here, I talked to the director of this museum, and she really showed me that there are significant tensions between different organizations over visibility, recognition, and access to resources. So this shows that the politics of representation can be pretty sticky. And it relates to the book by Maria Sayón, Becoming Heritage, which deals with somewhat similar dynamics in Palenque in Colombia. So in Museo de las Culturas Afro-Mestizas, there are these exhibits, anything that relates to Afro-descendant culture. So on the far left, you have Máscara from Danza de los Diablos, sort of one of these more traditional forms versus actually what we saw in the first video. We have a donkey jawbone, which is used in Danza de los Diablos. It's used in other types of performances in this region as well. And in a lot of cases, actually transnationally, the jawbone, some people argue, is a symbol of Black resistance from places like in Jamaica with John Canoe, places in the Southwest, American Southwest, and in Peru, where they have also a similar Danza de los Diablitos. That's an interesting feature that we see in the museum. And here's sort of a little video on how they represent sort of what life looked like before in that region. So how fieldwork informed my dissertation. So the fieldwork reshaped my project in important ways. It sharpened my focus from formal political processes, looking at that in a narrow scope, to looking at everyday cultural dynamics through music and dance in which Blackness and belonging are negotiated. So it allowed me to identify key contributors and case studies, and it strengthened my dissertation proposal, which asks, how do Afro-Mexican performers in Costa Chica use Chilena music and dance to assert Blackness, negotiate cultural memory, and engage with the logics of state folklorization and multicultural recognition today? And this has become sort of my leading research question now that's been adapted from the sort of preliminary questions I had pre-field work trip. So what are my next steps? In June, I'm going to be visiting Washington, D.C. to present at the Dance Studies Association Conference. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Camelia drag performance case study. I'm also working to secure long-term ethnographic funding to be able to do a long-term research project in Costa Chica. Some sites that I have received sort of leads on but have not been able to study are Artesa, which is another variant of Chilena in a small town called Ciruelo, and also people who perform Danza de los Diablos in Collantes. I've also have leads on different people I'd like to interview. Notably, there's these activist Chilena performers named Chogo Prudente and Alejandra Robles, and they're actually separate performers, but they both do similar things, and they perform Chilenas, they perform other genres of music, but they're always bringing up issues related to issues of recognition for Afro-descendants. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for your support. It's been really helpful, and it's helped me through this critical phase. So I'm excited to continue building on this work, and I'm really grateful for the investments that you've provided.